So again, this event is harnessing the power of domestic abuse. And it's our delight to host this webinar on the UN Commission on the Status of Women and to share the positive role that Christian faith is playing around the world in harnessing the power of the church to end domestic abuse. In this webinar, we will hear from a range of amazing people taking action in their own countries and beyond to prevent and end domestic abuse in both the communities and their churches too. UN Women states that 1 in 3 women in her lifetime will experience physical and/or sexual abuse. And we know that domestic abuse will affect women we know. That's the reality. There will be a woman attending this webinar that has experienced domestic abuse. And we want you to know that we stand with you. We are here for you. It is important to state right at the beginning that you can access help and support in your own country. If you do not know the helpline numbers, please go to hotpeachpages.net. I'm sure Esther will put that in the chat for you, hotpeachpages.net, which lists all of the national hotlines available. You can also check out the Pixel Project, who tweet out the helpline numbers each day on their Twitter account. If you are a survivor of abuse, please call your support helpline and get the help and information you need. Domestic abuse takes many forms, including emotional, psychological, and financial abuse, to name but 3. At the heart of domestic abuse is the abuse of power and the desire to control over another person, and using whatever tactic can do that to gain that power. A perpetrator of abuse can switch tactics to hold on to that power at any time. We also need to note that domestic abuse is a choice. It is a choice to abuse, and it's not due to alcohol, it's not due to job loss, it's not just used to or any other things. Many men have lost their jobs and got drunk and not chosen not to abuse women. These are myths, and we need to acknowledge that it is abuse. It is a choice to abuse. And at the heart of it, underlying all of this, is gender inequality and gender injustice. Those are a cause and consequence of gender-based violence and violence against women. And to eradicate it, we all need to make a stand. And today, you will hear from inspired individuals and organisations who have done just that and brought about change. So I want to introduce you to the speakers first. So today we have Ruth Utulu from Nigeria, and she's a Girls Brigade leader and activist. We also have Helen Fisher from Open Doors International, and she is a global gender persecution specialist. We have Tekeline Shifora, who's a peace building and trauma healing project leader from Ethiopia. And we have Becca Legg, who is the director of Restored. And then joining the team for the panel questions is Richard Proctor, the coordinator of Europe team with World Without Orphans, Ashima Samuel, the director of the Evangelical Fellowship of India and the Children at Risk programme, Ruby Naeem from Pakistan, church and NGO leader reaching out to marginalised women, and Amanda Jackson, director of the Women's Commission for World Evangelical Alliance, and not forgetting Amal Sarah from Pakistan. Sorry, Amal, I missed you out on the speakers, but Amal Sarah from Pakistan is also joining us. So that's who we have today. And I'm pleased to now hand over to Ruth to give us your talk and your video on the work that you've been doing. Over to you, Ruth.
All right. Hello, everyone. Nice to have you all here. I am Ruth Utulu from Nigeria. I'm married with a son and expecting another one. Yeah. I'm part of Girls Brigade International, and I have been a member for over 28 years, and I've been a leader for over 12 years. And Girls Brigade International is a Christian organization with a vision to be relevant, responsive, and relational to the plight of girls and women. We have a mission to empower girls, children, and young women around the world to be themselves, to develop, to use their skills, and discover what it means to live life in full. Over the years, the Girls Brigade has been positively affecting and transforming the lives of girls and women in different cities and communities in over 50 countries. Yes, 50 countries of the world. And one of the issues we hold dear to our hearts is eliminating violence against women and girls. And of course, that is because those are the group of people we deal with, young girls and women. I am sharing my experience as a Christian, as an African in Nigeria, as it regards domestic violence. Now, some statistics. Globally, it is estimated that 1 in 3 women experience either physical or sexual uh, intimate violence, in their lifetime. Now, we know that these figures are mirrored in Nigeria as well, with 30% of girls and women between 15 and 49 years old, reporting sexual abuse. Now, insurgency, which you must have heard several times in Nigeria, has also made these numbers to skyrocket. Now, it has made gender-based violence in the north to increase, and harmful practices such as child marriage are prevalent in Nigeria, with 43% of girls married before the age of 18, while 20% of women aged 15 to 49 have undergone female genital mutilation. So once a girl in Nigeria is married at an early age, just only 1.2% of those aged 15 to 19 have their contraceptive needs met, leading to high levels of early teenage pregnancy. And during the COVID-19, which had shook the world since last year, data reports incidences of gender-based violence cases in Nigeria from 24 states shows that in March 2020, the total number of gender-based violence incidents reported were 346, while in April, that's just a month after that, during the lockdown, the incidence spiked to 794, cases. There was so much increase in the level of, experiences of violence that were reported in Nigeria. So domestic violence in Nigeria is a problem, as in many parts of Africa. There is a deep cultural belief in Nigeria that it is socially acceptable to hit a woman, to discipline her. It's weird, but that's what is happening. Domestic violence takes many forms, including physical, sexual, emotional, mental, financial, to name but a few. Common forms of violence against women in Nigeria are rape, acid attacks, molestation, wife beating, and corporal punishment. Now, despite some laws that have been enacted, one of which uh, it has been recently enacted is the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act. This law is supposed to protect women or individuals against violence, especially domestic violence. But the truth remains that violence is hardly punished. The law enforcement and the judiciary will often turn deaf ears to reports of domestic violence and demand that couples go home and resolve differences because it is a family matter. The law is weak in protecting children who experience domestic violence, either from parents, guardians, siblings, or relatives. So it's it's terrible that the law cannot protect people as much as it should from domestic violence. Now, the church, on the other hand, has a passive approach to domestic abuse. Remember, this is my view from my experience and may not be applicable to other climes and denominations. But we are saying couples are always encouraged to forgive without proper investigation, therapy, or involvement of the law. So, more so, there's this silent culture surrounding domestic violence. Women, especially, hide such issues from family and friends, so as not to be talked about, shamed, or blamed, which is mostly the case. This silent culture has perpetuated the act to greater measures, so people would decide to keep quiet and suffer in silence. But the truth remains that the church carries so much power, I believe, to fight domestic violence because of its position of authority. And the Girls Brigade, as an organ of the church, has been contributing its quota in eliminating violence against women and girls. No, so here in Nigeria, we have for the past 5 years observed the International Day of the Girl Child. We hold events online, offline, sensitizing the public about the rights of the girl child, educating the girl child of the laws protecting her, and organizing, and organizations they can run to for help when the needs arises. So every year we carry out campaigns, to sensitize people about these issues. The- we as well observe the 16 days of activism where we engage public and stakeholders, on the need to end every form of violence against women and against everyone. And so we have personally taken it upon ourselves, to be the lights, even as members of the church, to help eradicate domestic violence and gender-based violence. I have personally been involved with a Boeing Girl project under the auspices of Girls Brigade. Now, we found out that one of the root causes why women are stuck in abusive situations here in Nigeria is the women's economic state. Because a lot of the women experiencing domestic abuse are not empowered, and because their means of livelihood depends solely on the man, they lack the willpower to leave their toxic marriages or fight back with the law. So when a woman is not empowered, she's not educated, she's not enlightened, she feels trapped and there's no way out. And that was why we initiated the Boy and Girl Project to help and empower women. So we initiated the program to equip women with fashion designing skills. And so far, 10 women have benefited from it. 10 women empowered and given a voice. And we hope to do more as we get more funding and support. So our international body took seriously the issue of the Chibok girls ever since the abduction in 2014. We have carried out campaigns, resources have been made designed to help girls advocate for social justice, and finances have been mobilized for rehabilitation of some of these girls that were released. So one thing I'm proud of is that the Girls Brigade has groups. We provide safe spaces for girls in our meeting groups. Young girls, teenagers, women, leaders are trained to be non-judgmental, accommodating, and always provide a listening ear and a shoulder for girls and other women to lean on. And this atmosphere has helped us reach out to girls and women who will ordinarily not open up to anyone else. Through these interactions, we have been able to help lots of girls and women through domestic abuse. This is our story from Girls Brigade perspective. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. It's a really good, quick overview, and thank you for speaking slowly. I'm sure the interpreters appreciated that, and it's good. And we will be able to have questions afterwards. Do put them in the chat box. Now, before I introduce my next speaker, I realised yet again that I did not introduce myself. My name is Mandy Marshall, and I am the Project Director for Gender Justice at the Anglican Communion. The Anglican Communion is a global organisation that covers 165 countries in 41 provinces around the world. And we are, as we have a delegation at the Commission on the Status of Women this year, with people from across the world. And I note that a couple of them are on this session too. So that's who I am, Mandy Marshall, Project Director for Gender Justice at the Anglican Communion. But now it's my delight to hand over to Teka, who is in Ethiopia. Teka, do you want to take it away? Teka, we're not hearing you.
Okay.
Ah, there you are. We can hear you now.
Hello, I'm sorry. My name is Teka Ling. You can call me Teka in short. Ethiopian's name is very challenging to pronounce. So I'm peace building and trauma healing project leader at ECFE, Evangelical Churches Fellowship of Ethiopia. It is a mega institution, a pioneer Christian institution here in Ethiopia. It has lasted for about 40 years here. I just arrived from the General Assembly of the ECFE. It is a 36th General Assembly. It's a mega assembly where public leaders have been attended. It's great to be part of this network and part of this movement. Before I proceed to my work, let me highlight for you why I joined this very important movement, ending violence against women. I grew up in rural area, southwestern part of Ethiopia, and I have observed so many things, so many abuses in the community. Let me start from my parent situation. Unfortunately, I didn't grow up in a very loving family. I was sharing my mom's feeling and her trauma because my dad used to abuse her. She was being tormented and abused. So because of the injustice I see against her, I inclined to her and share her feeling. I love to stay with her. So because of this feeling, I inclined to advocate for those who are abused. Just to give you my family's, my parents' destiny. My mom, my mom was desperate and she was not happy to live with my dad. And in this situation, she became pregnant. But unfortunately, she didn't want to give birth in that situation, and she took a traditional drug to keep the pregnancy. And sadly, that drug affected her womb, and she passed away by the cancer. And also, I observed the traumas women in my community faces. Abduction and rape is very common in our community. Girls are abducted from school. They are forced to live with men whom they do not have any encounter. So these all factors have contributed to my current career to pursue the movement that empowering women to be active in peace building and trauma healing. When I come to my current job, we implement project called peace building and trauma healing in 5 target zones. What I faced is that since I'm working with evangelical communities, I had an assumption that every Christian believer can adopt the view that God has created men and women in his own image. But the reality was not that. In one of my trainings, I just asked one of the top church leaders, asked him that, Reverend, do you believe that women are created in the image of God? And he was hesitant to respond to that question. And I asked, how come a top leader, a well-educated theologian, become hesitant on basic teaching of the Bible that women are created in the image of God? And after that, I aggressively started training top leaders on gender equality, and trauma healing, and so that they will be actively engaged in the community affairs. We have used two strategies. Since our community is patriarchal community, it is difficult to engage women in public affairs. So I decided that every training, every seminar, every workshop must engage half women. In that way, we started achieving half participants of women in every training we conduct. The second one is, once we give training, we network women. Then in the network, we facilitate opportunities for them, and then they gather together and plan and empower their fellow women in local churches and communities. So I see this fruit in short period of time. So this indicates that we can make change if we seriously consider women's contribution in peace building and other socio-political affairs. So my final remarks will be, let local churches follow the pattern of Jesus Christ. Jesus impressed women. He associated with women those who are excluded from the communities. So church leaders have to follow Jesus' pattern and include them in peace building and other socio-political affairs. The other one is, policymakers should consider the church as a strategic partner to end domestic violence against women. For example, in Ethiopia, we have 1/5 of the population, evangelical population. So empowering 1/5 of the population is very, very crucial to assure the result which we are aspiring to have. So the other one is those who have opportunities, for example, sisters in America, in Europe, in other parts of the world, should advocate for women who are disadvantaged, especially those who are living in underdeveloped countries. And it's horrible. They have carried cultural yokes and they are living in abject poverty. So intervention is very crucial. So I call upon every stakeholders to harness their power to make effective synergy and intervene in the situation of our dear sisters who are living in abject poverty. So this is my presentation. Thank you so much for inviting to this event. I'm very grateful for World Evangelical Alliance and my dear sister Baker. God bless you all.
Thank you so much, Teka. We really appreciate your contribution, and it's good in these spaces to have a man speak and to hear their perspective. One of the questions that I'll come back to, but I want you to think about while we go through the other speakers is, how do you encourage other men to get involved in speaking up and challenging gender inequality and gender injustice, and to work on ending domestic abuse? Don't answer that now. We'll come back to that, because I want to now move on to our next speaker, which is Helen Fisher from Open Doors. And Helen has done some research into some of the issues that Ruth mentioned at the start of this webinar. So Helen, great to have you with us, and thank you for sharing some of what you've discovered. We listen with intent of what you've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mandy. Open Doors International is deeply committed to supporting the work being discussed here today. For us, it is vital to ensure that homes, marriages, families are safe spaces of acceptance, freedom, trust, equality, and empowerment. And this is not just for the good of women and girls, but sometimes it's for the very survival of the church in the toughest times. Let me just take a couple of minutes to explain why we see it this way. Our research has shown that there is a clear distinction in how men and women experience religious persecution. In fact, our research looks at the intersection between a person's vulnerabilities in the area of either freedom of religion or belief and gender equality. Today, we're going to hear a lot about gender equality. And sometimes it's not obvious how it interacts with freedom of religion or belief, which I'll call FORB. Well, both of them are human rights and both can be violated. The orange arrow, as you can see on the screen,
Helen,
is bigger.
sorry,
Yeah.
can I ask you to slow down a bit? Thank you.
Oh, sorry. The orange arrow is bigger for women because there are more violations in this area against women than against men. And the way they interact can be as simple as how a crime drama works. If we think about crime in terms of detectives solving a crime and looking for three things: motive, means, and opportunity. When an individual violates the human rights of a Christian, motivated by religious differences, they can choose to do so by using the means of their socio-cultural context to identify the available opportunities to inflict harm. For example, if a non-Christian parent wishes to punish their daughter for converting to Christianity, they can exploit existing societal norms that accept early and forced marriage in order to subject her to a confined and subservient lifetime in a household opposed to her faith, if that's a normal thing to do. Now, there are two ways that normalized domestic abuse works against the church. The first is linked directly to religious persecution, usually of female converts to Christianity. And this year's research indicates that vulnerable converts are at even greater risk when they're locked in confinement with their families, who may abuse them for leaving the family's religion to convert to Christianity. The other thing that we can see, if we just move on to the next slide, has to do with a quick note on public versus private spheres of religious persecution. Religious persecution of men tends to be focused, severe, and visible, and it happens mostly in the public arena. Whereas religious persecution affecting women tends to be hidden, violent, and complex, and it happens more in the private sphere. So some of the most common global means of punishing or coercing women and girls for their faith happens at the hands of family members. But this, and this is my second point of how domestic violence is harmful to the church with regard to freedom of religion, some of the most detrimental responses to those who have experienced persecution comes from the hands of family members who can reject or shun or shame victims of violence because of their faith. And this happens most often in contexts of habitual domestic violence. Therefore, in the mindset of prevention is better than cure, it is in the interest of local faith actors to examine how we live behind closed doors. As faith-based groups, we have a choice as to how we develop habits of living with one another. And we'll be hearing some strong faith narratives to help us to do so. In times of crisis and pressure, our deeply ingrained habits are how we will continue to treat one another. Developing these habits of equality, trust, freedom, empowerment, and acceptance will protect the church. If you'd like to know more about how Open Doors has a program on that, let me know. We are delighted to be working together to promote with the WEA and others these positive ways of relating to each other at all times, no matter what.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you for that quick overview of some very detailed research that you've done over years. And that research is available via the links to this webinar, where you'll find other resources that are available from the participants and speakers in this webinar. So thank you, Helen. So now I want to hand over to Amal Sarah. Amal is from Pakistan and has worked with young people and people of faith in looking at ending gender-based violence and talking about gender justice. So Amal is part of the Anglican delegation to the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, and we welcome you here and your contributions, Amal. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. Thank you very much for this time. I'm privileged that I'm here to talk about the issues that our women in Pakistan are facing. And so this time is very important that God has given to me to speak on their behalf. So I would like to first talk about briefly about what the women in Pakistan are facing. Pakistan is a developing country, and the poverty rate is very high. About 29.5% people are living under the poverty line, which makes up to 5.5 million people of the total population. And so because of the poverty rate in Pakistan, many women are physically abused by their husbands. The reason lies in the fact that as we were talking, Mrs. Mandy Marshall, she shared very clearly that this is not the case that we say that the man is abused, so he starts to beat his wife. But the case is similar in Pakistan. It does happen. And men are physically abusing their wives because they are drug addicts. And due to the poverty rate in Pakistan, they tend to beat their wives because they are venting out their frustration. Because some of them are working as daily wagers, some of them are working as working in factories, and they get a very handful amount of income, which is insufficient to meet the needs of many people in their family. An average Pakistani family living in villages or slums has around 8 to 10 family members. And the amount that these daily wagers they get, that is not sufficient. And so the built up frustration is vented out on their wives. And these wives are taught to become submissive. They are taught to become obedient to their husbands. So they sacrifice their whole life on the name of physical abuse, but they don't leave their children. They don't leave their households because they think that this is our fate. They accept it as their fate and don't leave their homes and keep on being abused physically. Also, women in Pakistan, usually young brides, they are burned, they are beaten because they do not bring dowry, because since I already told you that the poverty rate is so higher, and when the family of the bride isn't able to afford the dowry, she's being abused by her in-laws. This is also part of the domestic abuse, and the ratio is quite higher in Pakistan, and women have to face this. Also, women are forced into conceiving again and again, forced pregnancies, because in Pakistan, it is considered that if we do not have a son, the family is not complete. And so a woman is forced into pregnancy again and again, which affects her reproductive health as well. And then when she doesn't bear a son and she gives birth to 5 or 6 baby girls, she's again blamed of giving birth to a large number of baby girls. And the husband and the in-laws say, now how we can feed them. And so a woman has an added pressure of earning for the family as well. And since the literacy rate for females in Pakistan is around 47%, and this is quite lower, the major portion of girls are not, literate. So all these things women have to face, and they are forced into prostitution, and all these things they have to, they are not able to earn for their families in a very honorable way. And so what the church is trying to do, we need to shift our focus towards this as well. The church is trying to, we at the women's department in the Diocese of Raivan, what we are trying to do is to provide them skill trainings. We are providing them midwife trainings and vocational trainings to make them financially stable, to make them emotionally strong. So even if they are facing hardships in their family life, they are able to provide food on the table for their children, to provide their medical and physical needs. And so many of our young females have been certified from these trainings and are now serving in different hospitals of Pakistan, and they're earning for their families. So, and together with that, we provide community capacity building programs for the females and for the males as well, because it is a dire need of the time to ask our males to understand the complications domestic abuse brings on their families. So we provide trainings, we provide awareness on legal rights, so that all these, both male and female, they try to overcome domestic abuse in their families. So lastly, what I would like to share is that how can church on the whole can play its part in eradicating domestic abuse. So all the forms that I've been sharing with you, the situation that women are facing and what we as the Diocese of Raivan, the Church of Pakistan, are doing to eradicate, what the church on the whole should do, which in Pakistan the church is not doing, I would say, because we are only inclined to giving sermons, giving Bible studies, but not addressing the issue of domestic abuse. So I think what the church should do is to incorporate the issue of domestic abuse into sermons, into different seminars, where we can include both male and female, and tell them that domestic abuse will affect your generations. And therefore, if the church worldwide will, I would like to say that we are all in same boat, and we should all continue our efforts in eradicating domestic abuse. So locally and both internationally, when the church will gather together for this cause, we will definitely, one day, we will be able to eradicate domestic abuse. The change doesn't happen overnight, but definitely one day we will be able to end domestic abuse. Thank you.
Thank you, Amal. It's so good to hear a young woman speak about that hope of one day we will end domestic abuse. And thank you for what you've shared. A question for you to think about before we go to our next speaker, and I'll come back to you afterwards, is where do you think, as young people are often the ones that most suffer domestic abuse at an early age, 16 to 24, how do you think that the church could engage with young people to educate them about domestic abuse? So have a think about that, and I'll come back to you afterwards.
Sure.
Thank you, Amal.
Sure. You're welcome.
And now I want to hand over to Becca Legg, the director of Restored, who has done some amazing work on research as well about domestic abuse in churches too. I just wanted to clarify before we did that, what Amal said about, you know, it's because of this, because of that. We recognise that there are contributing factors, and I think that's what Amal was talking about, the contributing factors that that go into domestic abuse, like the job loss and like poverty. They are contributing factors, but they aren't the cause. The root cause is that, you know, inequality, and we would call it sin, selfishness, and the heart of abuse of power and control. But there are lots of contributing factors that create that frustration, that they can then make a choice be made to explode into some form of abuse. So, Becca, over to you, and we're interested to hear what you're saying from the UK. So we've had Nigeria, we've had Ethiopia, we've had USA, we've had Pakistan, and now we're into Europe. So over to you, Becca.
Thank you, Mandy. It's such a privilege to be here and actually to represent the organisation that you founded 11 years ago. It's very kind of you to say that I've done lots of research. It was actually you, but I shall try and represent it to the best that I can. And my name's Becca, and I lead Restored, a Christian charity working to speak up about violence against women and equip the church to stand against domestic abuse and stand with survivors. We have a history of working with partners around the world to challenge and change attitudes towards women, but our key focus now is working with the church in the UK. We're delighted to be part of the Christian network to end domestic abuse, joining our voice and our vision with our brothers and sisters around the world to stand against abuse through the church. And we recognise that whilst poverty, mental health issues and persecution can exacerbate domestic abuse, those things are never the underlying reason. Domestic abuse is always a choice to exert power and control over one who is viewed as unequal. And it's not limited to any one social group. Domestic abuse exists in every group in the society, and even the church is not immune. In fact, it often adds extra layers of complexity to the issue. Together with the universities of Leicester and Coventry, Restored conducted research in 2018 with churchgoers in Cumbria, which is a region in the north of the UK. This research revealed that 1 in 4 churchgoers had experienced abuse in a current relationship, but that women were more than 4 times as likely to have reported sexual or financial abuse. In over 90% of cases, the perpetrator was male. For too long, the church has at best turned a blind eye to domestic abuse, or at worst has colluded with it. And we have to be honest and acknowledge that sometimes church has been part of the problem. Now, our research showed that churches rarely speak to the issue of domestic abuse. 57% of churchgoers had never heard a sermon that addressed the topic, and only 2 in 7 of those surveyed thought that their church was adequately equipped to deal with a disclosure. Domestic abuse can be a taboo subject. Marriage is honoured at all costs, oh, excuse my doorbell, and women can be left feeling as though they have to choose between their faith on one hand and their freedom. But it's not the whole story. Church has also been part of the solution, following in its great history of campaigning for and bringing about social justice. And we believe that with the right support, it's ideally placed to be a light in the darkness and to take a far greater role in changing the beliefs and attitudes of not just its congregations, but the wider communities to change the story for women around the world. Now, Restored works in 3 key areas. We speak up about the realities of violence against women. At a governmental level, that looks like lobbying for policy change, judicial reform, and inclusion of faith groups in the conversation. On a church level, it involves raising awareness of domestic abuse in and outside of the church, challenging traditional theologies of the roles of and relationships between men and women, and crucially engaging men in the conversation. All of our work is survivor informed. Restored hosts an online international community of Christian female survivors of domestic abuse, and it is their lived experiences and their voices that we represent wherever we go. Our survivors network has been a lifeline to hundreds of women but it's also provided the inspiration and the information that we need to speak up and do something. Restored works to equip the church to be a safe space for survivors. And we have a vision of creating a network of churches across the country and indeed the world, which stands against abuse, that does not turn the other way, but challenges abuses of power, speaks out against abuse, and provides the loving support that survivors so need on their road to recovery. And we do this through training church leaders and lay leaders alike, re-examining theology, developing an understanding of domestic abuse, and training churches to suitably support survivors and respond to perpetrators. We've created a manual for church leaders available in 10 languages, currently being translated into Swahili, and we provide one-to-one support to church leaders who need advice as they deal with domestic abuse in their communities. This year's just so far, in the last couple of months, we've trained over 50 people, 3/4 of whom say they feel more equipped to support a survivor of abuse, and all of whom would recommend the training to others. Their churches are now not just safer places for those that attend their services, but they're making a positive difference in the community. It really matters that we equip the church to support those who've been broken by abuse and enable them to flourish in freedom. An example of a church that's been doing this for years is a fantastic Salvation Army church in South London. Emma Scott, the officer in charge, felt called to respond to the needs of survivors in her community, and she created a drop-in centre for survivors of domestic abuse, trained volunteers to befriend these women and to walk alongside them as they navigated leaving their abusers, court cases, social services, and the complications of parenting after abuse. This one leader, through her church, has supported nearly 250 survivors of domestic abuse over 5 years. Or there's Oliver Lamping, another church leader in Reading, who brought together his experience working with perpetrators for his local council and his passion for church to start working with abusers within the church, to change attitudes and to fundamentally stop the cycle of abuse in its tracks. We're excited to be looking at ways of extending the reach of his work and replicate it in churches around the UK. Imagine what we can do if we inspire, train, and equip more leaders. You see, the church is in every neighbourhood, in every town and village, not just in the UK, but around the world. And it carries enormous influence in and outside of its walls. And that influence can and should be harnessed to change the story for women and girls and to end domestic abuse. Thank you.
Thank you, Becca, for that talk. And before you go, just remind us of those statistics again of the research. What were they?
I began with, so 1 in 4 of churchgoers had experienced domestic abuse within their current relationship. Women were 4 times as likely to have experienced sexual abuse or financial abuse, and much more likely to have experienced severe physical abuse. But churches don't talk about it. So only 57% of people had never ever heard a sermon that spoke about domestic abuse in any shape or form.
Yeah, so thanks, Becca, for sharing that. I wanted to highlight that because it shows the importance of why we need the church to speak out and to speak up about domestic abuse, and also acknowledge that it's in our churches too, and not just out there, that we need to put our own house in order too. So thank you, Becca. So we have all of our speakers. We can now get the panelists together, and as we come back together and get everybody up, are joined by the others in the group. So just a reminder of who else we're being joined with on this panel. So we have Ruth, Helen, obviously Teka, Amal, and my mind's gone blank. Ruth, Helen, Teka, Amal, Becca, and now we're joined by Richard, Ashima, Ruby, Amanda Jackson, to look at some of the questions. But before we go into the broader questions that we've been receiving and some of those that I've asked the panelists already to think about, I want to really ask those of you that have spoke, in the process of doing your work, how have you been transformed in that process? Because we're not about just doing things to others. Actually, in the process of working through these issues, we are transformed ourselves. So maybe, Teka, can I come to you first, and then I'll go to Ruth. How have you been transformed in doing this work personally?
Yep. I have been repented so many times after working with women and reading about violence against women. You know, we just hear stories, but we do not consider detailed things as an abuse. So to be frank, I have repented so many times. Oh, this is abuse. Oh, that is abuse. So, oh, that was wrong. I was just thinking like that. And working with women is so exciting for me. I mean, they are very active. They grasp things and then they are fast to implement. Especially, we do so many trainings in peace building, but men, I'm sorry to say, like to talk so much and give suggestions on these issues and that issues, but they are not focused and they are not eager to implement what they have gleaned from the training. But women are inspiring me with their very active acceptance of the lessons and implementation, especially in one of my project target zones. I just suddenly arrived in the project target zones and I see the network which I established, gathered and doing action plan to train other women in peace building and to visit prisoners. This is magnificent. We can't do this with a big budget. We cannot do this with millions of birr. We call it, our currency is birr. But they are just implementing what they have learned. And I'm so much happy about that. And
So then,
you know what? Okay.
Sorry, Teka, I was going to say, so given that you're inspired by women and you listen to women, and I think that's such an important point, that men listen to the voices of women. So thank you for saying that. But I also, I guess, come on to my other question is, so how do we get men involved in this issue? Because it's so important that other men join in the cause. What would you say? How do we do that? Yeah,
that's a very challenging question, because our community is very patriarchal and many African countries are led by the main line. So when I aggressively approach our community mobilizers that we have a strict checklist that half of the participants must be women. What? And they were not happy about that. But gradually, they have seen my seriousness on that. Not only gender, but I am also serious on age. We try to keep gender age balance. But finally, we gathered those all key leaders to reflect, and they said, you know what? The women's engagement in our community and in our church has been enhanced after this project has been started. I didn't expect such a witness from those who have been opposing me. So in our network, key church main leaders are engaging in peace building, and I found that is hope giving, I think.
Thank you, Teka. It's really important to have male allies in this course. So thank you for what you're doing. Ruth, I just want to bring you back in from the start. So how have you been transformed in the process of what you have been doing in Nigeria? And it's hard work that you're doing there. It's difficult work. So how have you been transformed in that work?
All right, thank you. I must say it has really, truly transformed me. One thing I can say is it has helped me to become more compassionate. I have become more considerate and understanding with people, because you never know what people have been through. You know, a lot of the times you see behaviors, you see reactions, and then you're tempted to just act and defend yourself and speak out. But then with what I have experienced, lots of people have gone through a lot and they are not seeing it. They are battling it a lot. So the world needs a lot of love. I can say it has made me to show love, to show care and concern, even when people are resisting it. They're building walls around themselves and making you feel they don't need you. A lot of the time they do. And recently we have found out that, you know, in Nigeria, lots of adults from age 28 towards 40 have been abused, you know, growing up, different types of abuse, molestation. But then because there are no places for therapy where people you can speak to, many suffered it in silence. And just a few are trying to come out in their adulthood now to say, I have been through this and that. So most of the time when you see people here being so aggressive, being so, they've been through so much. So it has helped me to become more compassionate and loving towards people, despite their behaviors towards me, because you never know what they've been through. And then secondly, I must say it has helped me in my choice of marriage. You know, as a young girl, before I got married, because of the teachings I've had, you know, and the experiences, the stories we've heard from our mentors, I came to the understanding that I cannot settle with someone that does not respect women and does not regard women. So I keep telling friends that if I am dating someone and he raises his hands to hit me, but he did not hit me, he remembers and retrieves the hand, I will end the relationship. You don't have to hit me. Like, just knowing that you have the tendencies, I will end it. You know, so it really shaped me and helped me in making sound choices, you know, when it came to choosing a life partner. It's been transformative, I must say.
It's so good to hear. It's so good that you've got a little one on the way that you are making at the moment in our relationship. That's good. I might want to bring you back in a little bit later with the youth question with Amal, but I just want to go to Helen first in terms of, you know, when you're conducting this research and you're starting out, you have an idea of what you might expect, but were you surprised by what you found and how did that impact on you?
Yeah. So we did have an idea of where this would go because I traveled around the globe with the Open Doors programs, and I kind of been hearing these stories that repeated over and over. Didn't matter what continent I went to, the women were telling me the same stories, and it was different than what the men were telling me. And a lot of it had to do with sexual violence. What I didn't expect was that actually when we did a kind of full survey, that forced marriage would come out as an equal way of controlling or punishing women for their faith, which is a form of almost formalized sexual violence. It's a way of holding captive a woman for her whole life for sexual abuse and also removing her from the Christian environment. And just that that prospect of living death, really. It's all of these women who are still alive. They haven't been massacred like a lot of the men have, but they're either trapped in a marriage, and that's a kind of prison, or they've been sexually attacked because of their faith, and they're then shunned by the community, and that puts another kind of prison. That's it's just as constraining, and it isolates and it removes possibilities for action, and picturing that going on year after year, holding women's hands and saying this hand has to, you know, go through every single day, trying to figure out what to do, how to live, and just that realization. You know, Mandy, you said, before we point the finger somewhere else, we have to do some house cleaning, you know, and saying, okay, let's look at the decisions that we're making. And I spent a certain amount of time in Central African Republic because I live in France, so I speak French, and so I went to Centrafrique, and and just saw the choices that the church had made because they thought that that's what God wanted them to do. So we then developed some socio-biblical materials saying, what are those systematic misunderstandings that mean that we're behaving in a really painful, harmful way within the church to other church members, and usually against women and girls. And it's been a terrible and wonderful journey. One of saying this is so incredibly painful, but actually it's not what God wants. And just saying, okay, our faith gives us incredible hope and power.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, it's when you hear story after story after story, it has a huge impact on you in terms of that, you know, what choice is there. And this is where, you know, we know from a Christian perspective that Christ came to give us freedom and freedom of choice, and we should be replicating that, and we're not quite doing that in our churches. So yeah, thank you for what you're doing. I want to bring in Amal now. Amal, how in the work that you've been doing in Pakistan, and we know the situation in Pakistan is quite hard for women and girls. So how have you been transformed in the work that you are doing, particularly as a young woman, I think?
Thank you very much for giving me this platform. This is an interesting question, and when I was thinking about how it has transformed me, actually, you know, negative force always drives you to do something positive, and this is something that has happened with me. When I was a young girl, like 10 years ago, I was too shy, I would say. I wasn't so expressive like I am now. So the driving forces were there already. I was looking at people, I was looking at watching news, all those cases of domestic abuse. And then I started to work in the church. I realized that people have so many problems. Why am I not trying to speak on their behalf? And then I submitted to God. Of course, God was with me in all these things. And I always had those vibes that there is something God wants from me to do. And then I looked at people, I met them. There was another story which boosted up my confidence. I became confident when I met people. And when I started to work for domestic abuse, I started to do that about officially like for about 2 years. But before that, I was doing some volunteer work. I was engaged with other youth groups, but I started to work for advocating for gender justice from last 2 years. And in these 2 years, I transformed myself in a way that I became confident. I interacted with the community. I tried to approach those people who were unapproachable. Because in a conservative Pakistani society, women are not even allowed to go alone into the market if a male member is not with that, even if the male member is a 6 years old son or a brother. So you have to keep someone while you're going outside. So I try to approach those women because when I became confident, I tried to make other women confident and empowered. So I now live with the notion of include the excluded. This is a notion that I live with now. And I always say that we have to include those people whom, like Jesus included the Gentiles. Jesus included those who were rejected. So I'm living on those lines that we have to include those people. So working for gender justice changed me as a person very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Amal. Now, before I ask you the youth question, which I'll bring you and Ruth back in a minute for the youth question, I just want to bring in Ruby, because Ruby's based in Pakistan. And I'd just like to bring in Ruby, like for you, Ruby, and the work that you do, how are you seeing the situation in Pakistan with women and girls and domestic abuse?
Thank you, Mandy, for giving me this opportunity. You know, this is a really insightful webinar for me. And I just want to, first of all, before I answer the question which you asked, you know, let me just share my heart, because I think this is a great platform where I can become voice for those, you know, who are voiceless. I think it's so important to understand our culture. We live in honor and shame culture, where a woman is considered an object, a commodity. And when you were talking about the choice, I was thinking, choice. I mean, is it really something for Pakistani women? No. we don't have any choices. We are just objects. Seriously, maybe my words are very, very strong even for the church, but I think let me just pour out my heart, because really right now I'm so passionate. um, uh, so just imagine, you live in such a culture where 97% of people are from the Islamic context. They have the Islamic beliefs. I was hearing to Becca, and she was just talking about two or three things which really touched my heart: changing attitude, beliefs, re-examining theology. And I think this is what I'm doing right now. It's so important, because you are just 2% in the country, and you are so much influenced by the Islamic beliefs, where a man is always considered as a ruler. And I think you bring the same theology to the church. And that's where I'm fighting. That's where I'm telling people that, look at Bible, go back to Bible and see, we have equal status. This word equal is very, very intimidating to all the patriarchal society. Like Taka said, it's a patriarchal society where a person like me, who's already strong with a high tone, is not acceptable. And there we are, how can we help church? So let me just share, I think I'm not really ashamed to share this, that I myself is a survivor of domestic violence, because Naim and myself, my husband, we both went to a seminary, but you could imagine people who are already in ministry, for them, abuse is like, it's a very normal practice, because church has not spoken about it. And even something, when a domestic violence actually happens in any home, no one actually comes to help you. So you just have to deal with that pain for years and years. But I really thank God. I just want to mention a couple, who came from UK back almost 15 years ago. They really empowered our marriage. They really helped us to understand. They really opened the theology, the biblical text to both of us. That see, uh, uh, domestic violence is actually, you have to understand that you both are equal. And unfortunately, as Pakistani women and girls, we are raised with this mindset. This word submission, I think Amal already mentioned this: submission or obedience. I think this is actually misinterpreted in the church. Submission means accept domestic violence. You have no choices because you're just object. You know, so this is a sort of situation we are living in, and I believe that if men are with us, we can actually help other people to replace their cultural beliefs with strong biblical beliefs. And that's what God is doing through me and my husband. 15 years ago, once we were out of this situation, we dealt with it, we confessed, we forgave each other, and then we said, let's just go out and help other marriages. Now, my experience over the years with people who are actually in ministry, people who are actually work in the church, domestic violence is a very common thing. And it really, my heart aches, because I think this is the time where church needs to take initiative. The problem is the people who are in ministry, patriarchal, these men, they also practice domestic violence. So how can they go on the pulpit and talk about it? How can they talk about the gender equality, So I forgot your question, Mandy, what you actually are. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I just became so passionate.
Because what it's done is share your heart and your passion. And it's good to hear your passion about wanting to transform marriages into better, and speaking about what is a healthy relationship. And that is not negating the consequences of domestic abuse and how people need to face the consequences of their actions and their behavior. And I want to make that clear because I think that's important. But also you raise the issue of submission. And I think this is something crucial that the church needs to address, is the theology, and the theology around gender and the terminology that we have in our Bible. And, the Greek word for submission is hupotasomoi. Do I hupotasomoi my my husband, and that is it is submission. It's not obedience, which is used further down in the passage, and the passage we're talking about is Ephesians 5 in the Bible, which talks about wives submitting to their husbands. But before it gets to that, it says submit yourselves to one another. So actually husbands should submit themselves to their wives. So a question you could ask is, well, it's an equal ask. So husbands, when did you last submit yourself to your wife? Because the Bible says that you should. Now, the answer we know is probably a laugh, because they probably don't do that. But it is hupotasomoi, means a voluntary submission of a person, and it's done in the context of love. And it cannot be forced. It cannot be asked for. It has to be done voluntarily. So if a husband says, you need to submit to me, that's unbiblical, because that's not what the word or the terminology means in that passage. So you're right to point it out, that actually, what does submit mean, and what is an equal ask? Actually, husbands are supposed to submit to their wives too. So thank you, Ruby, for sharing, and thank you also for sharing the gift of your story, that your situation, and making yourself vulnerable on this platform. And I really appreciate that, because I know that's a difficult thing to do. So I honor you and thank you for sharing that, Ruby. It's really important.
Thank you, Mandy. Thank you.
I want to bring back in Amal and Ruth, if I may. And Ruth, can I ask you first about how do you think we should engage young people in raising awareness on domestic abuse, given that the statistics are that younger people are more likely to experience domestic abuse? What would you say? From the Girls Brigade International, you're there, you're targeting, you're working with young girls.
Yeah. So for me, I would say to get young people aware and informed about domestic violence, we have to create opportunities for such discussions. Like what we've been learning from all the speakers, there's a lot that needs to be done in the church. And in one of the sessions I attended during this United Nations Commission on Status of Women, I learned about a model called the graduation model by Concern International. And I saw how they were able to program a model a program where they helped families come out from, abuse, help them to learn and understand that there are better ways to live as a family. So I feel that the church can do something like that. Open Doors with Helen Fisher, they can design a model for the church to use to actually guide young people, because we have forums like youth forums in the church, we have the children's department, we have places like Girls Brigade in the church. So if these young people, there can be a weekend seminar, you gather them and then you begin training young people about domestic violence. They are eager to learn at that age. They're eager to know about new things. And so if the church can begin to mention these things, we will actually see change. But then it must be measurable, not just like a sermon. That's why I'm saying it should be a model, something that can be measured, something that can be implemented and evaluated, so that after it, we can check and see, okay, before we implemented this model, how were their thought patterns? And now that we have finished this program, has it really brought about change in the lives of young people? So I feel this is one thing we can do that can help young people in the church.
Thanks, Ruth. And I think what you raised an important point there is that the church does gather young people together in many countries, and that provides us with an opportunity to speak out and to teach, and that we shouldn't shy away from that. So yeah, thank you for raising that point. And the fact that the church is in many different communities around the world, and there's a great opportunity there for actually spreading these positive messages about what a healthy relationship looks like, and also what to be aware of in terms of domestic abuse. Thanks, Ruth. Amal, you've been doing work with young people, haven't you, in your province when you've been training on domestic abuse? And what has the reaction been to some of the people that you've spoken to?
First of all, domestic abuse in Pakistan is a private matter. People don't like when you try to intervene into their homes. They have a strong reaction to it. But just as someone was saying that we in ministry, we have to face abuse, as Ma'am Ruby was saying, this is so true. When you are in ministry, when you're working for the people, you have to don't think about what they are, we have to, intervene into the problem, because the problem is so increased. Domestic abuse problem has so increased that we need to talk to the people who are facing it. We have to interact with the victims. And so the reaction was definitely not so good, not so positive. But we try to engage 50% men and 50% women in all those domestic abuse programs that we conducted in rural parishes, especially. Because in rural parishes, people lost their jobs. They were facing this emotional abuse. They were emotionally abusing each other because many people, the factory owners, they shut down their businesses, and those people who were working in those factories, they have to face financial breakdown. And the domestic abuse problem increased in their families to a greater extent. So the time to remain quiet is gone. It's time to speak up. So we became so determined. I always say I'm a stubborn girl. I don't care about what everybody else is saying. We have to reach out to people. And when we discuss these problems with the women in the churches, they were so, there was a shock that somebody has come to us and spoke on these lines, which we are not even allowed to share our bedroom stories, our home household stories with others. The reaction was definitely there, but we kept on doing the work.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm sure I could listen to you all day, but I'm aware that time is running out so quickly. And I want to bring in Richard and then Ashima, who are on our panel. And Richard, I really want to ask you, in your role, how do you think that the churches can contribute positively to spaces like the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women and like our governments? How can we influence them positively on domestic abuse?
Wow, what a great question. And just thank you to those that have spoken as well for your passion and humility and commitment and skill. It's humbling to learn, and I'm here, I think, mainly as a learner. And I think, so where we in World Without Orphans work is particularly with the focus that children should live in stable and nurturing and permanent families. And I think one of the biggest drivers as to why children don't live in those circumstances is because of domestic abuse in its various forms. And we know that often women will be abused, fathers will leave the home. That leaves women in a situation of poverty, and often that results in children not being able to be with the family, so they're put in orphanages where over 80% of the children actually do have living family. We were really delighted to come to your question, Mandy, when the United Nations countries signed in December 2019 a declaration that they would all commit to family-based care, whereby children would stay in families and not be put into institutions. But underneath all of that, of course, is you can't just suddenly either close institutions or put children back into families where abuse is taking place, because it only exacerbates the problem, or ends up in children living on the streets, or on women with their children just living destitute lives. So I think what we are finding is that in individual countries where our country leaders are working, one of the ways they come to attention of government is just actually by getting stuck in on the ground. We've had plenty of examples where people have been training carers and parents in how to parent children who have experienced trauma. And it just comes to the attention of either local government. In one case in Moldova, the children's minister was walking down a corridor and wondered what was going on in the room, only to find out what was happening. And that's because of the commitment of Christians on the ground. And that's one of our experiences, is that the church is able to meet people in their villages, in their towns, because the Christian leaders are located there. Because that gets seen, it gives them a voice. And so we've had government ministers, I mentioned Moldova, equally a similar story in Bulgaria. And I know there are others around the world, but I work in Europe. Has resulted in them being invited to sit with government ministers and talk about what do we need to do. And that has affected government policy. In Romania recently, a law has just been passed because of the influence of Christians working and then going through the courts to get a law to allow adoption to take place. In Paraguay, I know that they're working very closely with government to create structures that protect families. And I think, although I'm speaking from the point of view of care of orphans, the issues that we're talking here are very, very closely interrelated. A lot of it is about the protection of women, and perhaps just finally, because of the context we're in, to say it's very moving for me as a Western man born in the 1950s, having to unlearn many of the habits of and thought patterns of youth, is to see how many of the people making a difference to family life, as I've just described it around the world, are women who, in one case, I think of Anu in India, who was brought up in an orphanage, established an orphanage, and is now leading a process to protect families and help families to stay together and to make families a safe place for both for the adults as well as for the children. So it's just very impressive. So I hope I've answered your question. But
you have. I think what we're saying is actually sometimes we have this thing, false sort of dichotomy in Christianity that we can't, politics and government don't, politics and religion don't mix. And what we're actually saying is, yes, they do, and yes, we should be involved. And actually, the reach of the local church is at that community level where we're actually making a difference, and that can actually inform policy. And that's why it's important that as Christians we're getting involved in politics, is actually because we can inform from the community level and raise our voices with other people to actually bring about the changes that we want to see. And you've
add just one small point, which is the parenting tips that I put in the chat. It was because we had the connections on the ground that effectively a document which had been put out by the World Health Organization and other UNICEF and other international bodies, the reason it reached families was because of the activities of Christians. So that was global political institutions and national institutions working together with local church leaders to make a global initiative become local. And I think that was very powerful.
Thanks, Richard. And I want to ask you before you go, which I asked the other panelists, is how have you been transformed personally in this process? You said you had to unlearn many things. What are some of the things that you have had to unlearn? Or do you want to talk about? I know I'm putting you on the spot, so you don't have to answer if you don't want to. And Ashima, I haven't forgotten about you. Don't worry, I'm going to come to you, Ashima.
I think historically, personally, my style has been to be fairly directive in my leadership, only strengthened by 6 years as a police officer. So what I've had to unlearn as I've engaged in this is that I have the answers and that I have the authority, and actually the power of us to make a difference to the world is by listening more and engaging more with each other. And I've had to learn that and develop a new style of leading teams, of connecting with individuals, which starts by a lot of listening and then helping us to collate together what our mutual understanding is. Excuse my internal phone, I'll ignore it. So that we get the best result, which pulls in everybody's knowledge and instincts of any gender, of any background, not just my really clever white British middle class Western powerful male point of view.
Thank you, Richard. And I think, yeah, that's an important point. It comes back as to looking at the diversity of leadership styles and that God gave them us all, and also that we need to listen more and honour other people's experiences. So thank you, Richard. Ashima, thank you, Ashima, for waiting all this time.
You're welcome, Mandy.
You're very, very gracious and very patient with us. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the work that you're involved in and how it relates to domestic abuse?
Yeah, and first of all, I want to thank you once again for this opportunity. And it was so encouraging to hear the voices of justice out here. It was truly marvelous to see how we have these blended voices coming together at one platform and speaking up and standing up for justice. And as we talk about domestic violence, one of the factors that I want to highlight out here is trafficking. When we are talking about trafficking, possibly we'll not be able to think or even comprehend how it cross-cuts each other, domestic violence and trafficking and human trafficking. And in India, it's a huge country and you have this culture of silence. It's quite across South Asia, and India just leads on to it. And how can we break this culture of silence? And we see that there's a lot of violence that's taking indoors, which is not coming out because of family heritage and various other factors. And then one day you come to know that the girl is not there, or the lady or the woman of the house is not there. She's sold and trafficked. Why? Because you just want to curb her voice. If she is also trying to raise a voice within her own household, or trying to object to it, or trying to stand up for her own self, possibly if she's equipped by a church, or if she's equipped by people like Ruby or Amal, and she wants to stand up, and she wants to stand up for her rights, and she's against this, the easiest way is just to sell her. Earlier we used to hear about dowry deaths in India, and we used to hear about accidental deaths and all. But the latest trend, or the target is of just selling the life, and also gaining something out of it, right? And we've got stories out here where we've rescued women who have been facing domestic violence and have been trafficked also. And I would just like to highlight that it's also about the situation that they're trapped in. It's the situation, the desperation, that suppose they want to help, and you've got local people who know about this situation. They come and befriend with them and strike this friendship. And then later on, you see, because the woman wants to run out of a situation, she's sold and trafficked into somewhere else. I just like to highlight one important point out here while addressing domestic violence is how can we engage, and how can the church, most importantly, how can the church engage towards justice, advocacy, and also changing and inspiring the people out there within the area and community, is building the voices of the youth. We just did one of a program with the youth within the communities at the local level, because we firmly believe that the church is so strategically placed that it's got people within the communities who we need to change the mindset. And for this International Women's Day, we conducted a youth rally where the young girls, because we need to equip the girls to say no before they enter into any kind of a marriage. We need to equip the girls also beforehand to say no to any kind of violence and injustice. And there were boys and there were young girls, and they all came together. And this youth network is called Knocking Young Hearts. And that, how are we knocking young hearts? How are we teaching them, equipping them to say no? And and we organized a cycle rally, and this is within the premises and the youth within the churches who we equipped. And they had on the International Women's Day, we saw young boys and coming in and doing cycle rallies and wearing, like, we stand up for gender equality. We are against any kind of violence against women. So how are we raising these voices within the churches? How are we so this is what we are engaged in, where we are doing a lot of women-to-women networking, because as we've heard a lot out here, that listening is one of a very important aspects. So, and sometimes...
Yeah, I'm going to have to... Yeah.
Sorry.
The problem with panel events is we want more time and to have more people speaking and to sit and listen at your feet. And sadly, our time has gone. It's like, how on earth has that gone so quickly? But people can get in touch with each of our panelists via the NGO Forum facility, and you can contact them direct if you click on their name, if you want to connect with them and find out more about what they're doing. And I think, as Shimo just mentioned, a really important point there too is about the environment that people are in. And it's actually, we need to change at a personal level. We need to change at a community level. We need cultural change, societal change. We need law change, and we need that structural change so that everybody has the opportunity to be all that God created them to be, and to prevent and end domestic abuse. So I want to thank you all of our panelists, all of our speakers for the work that you are doing, for the work that you will continue to do, and for the barriers that you face and still overcome them. Because we know, particularly as Christians working in this area, that you can face additional barriers that you perhaps shouldn't expect to face. So thank you for continuing. Thank you for persisting. Thank you for your patience. And thank you for the work that you are doing in honouring God. Now, thank you for those of us that have joined us today. There are resources available on the webinar site. There are some in the boxes. And as I say, you can contact us after the webinar to discuss issues further with us and find out more information. I would just say from the Anglican Communion perspective, if you go onto the Anglican Communion website under the gender justice area, you will find some theological resources available to look at some of those issues that I discussed with Ruby about the language and terminology in the Bible. There are other things from the WEA, Women's Commission has written a booklet on exactly that. So please utilize these materials that are freely available for you and available in different languages. And to that I say, thank you for being with us. I hope it's inspired you. I hope it's encouraged you. And I hope you've seen the positive role that Christian faith can play in ending domestic abuse. Thank you. Okay, so people are leaving. If we stop the recording, that would be great.